They expected the Duke to fall forward into his soup, perhaps even die right there at the head of the table. What no one expected was for every noble guest to abandon their seats and flee toward the doors like startled birds, leaving only the lowest servant in the room kneeling beside him, pressing her fingers to his wrist and speaking words in a language that shouldn't have meant anything to a man supposedly unconscious. And yet, his eyes opened. The evening had begun with all the polished grandeur Ashford Manor was known for. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across imported silk wallpaper. Servants moved like shadows between courses, perfectly timed, perfectly silent. And at the center of it all sat Duke Hartley Ashford, presiding over a dinner meant to secure a trade alliance that would reshape half the county's economy. Across from him sat Lord Callum Verne, a merchant baron whose wealth rivaled old nobility, but whose manners did not. He smiled too widely, spoke too loudly, and treated servants like furniture. The other guests, minor lords, a viscount, 2 barons, watched the Duke carefully, trying to determine which man held more power in the room. Mira Fenwick stood near the serving board, a water pitcher balanced in both hands. She had worked at Ashford Manor for 8 months and had perfected the art of being overlooked. Her uniform was always pressed, her hair always pinned, her expression always neutral. No one asked her opinions. No one asked her name twice. But Mira noticed everything. She noticed Lord Verne's wine glass refilled 4 times while others went untouched. She noticed the Duke barely eating, his jaw tight with restraint as Verne dominated the conversation with increasingly crude remarks disguised as humor. She noticed the way the Duke's knuckles whitened around his fork when Verne mentioned expanding his holdings into territories the Ashford family had protected for generations. "Of course," Verne said, leaning back with theatrical ease. "Tradition has its place. But profit has a longer memory than sentiment. Wouldn't you agree, Your Grace?" The Duke's voice remained even. "I find that legacy and profit need not be opposed." Spoken like a man whose legacy was handed to him. Verne smiled as though he'd said something charming. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. The insult was clear enough. The Duke set down his fork with deliberate calm. And spoken like a man who mistakes inheritance for incompetence. Verne's smile thinned. No offense intended. And yet, given. The air tightened. Mira refilled the guest's water glass and moved back toward the wall, her heart beating faster than it should. She'd seen the Duke handle disagreements before. Always controlled, always measured. But there was something different tonight. A tension beneath his composure, like a string pulled too taut. Verne shifted tactics, gesturing broadly. "Come now, Your Grace. Surely we can discuss terms without theatrics. Unless you're too proud to negotiate with men who've built their own fortunes." The Duke's gaze didn't waver. "Pride has nothing to do with refusing terms designed to strip my people of their livelihoods." "Your people?" Verne laughed. "You sound like a shepherd defending sheep. I sound like a man who understands responsibility." Verne leaned forward, voice dropping just enough to seem dangerous. "Then understand this. If you refuse my partnership, I'll build around you. Through you, if necessary. Either way, I'll have what I came for." The Duke opened his mouth to reply, and then he stopped. His hand went to his chest, just briefly, just a flutter of movement, but Mira saw it. Saw the way his breathing changed. Saw the color drain from his face in the span of a single heartbeat. The Duke stood abruptly, chair scraping back. Every guest looked up. "Your Grace?" someone ventured. He didn't answer. His hand gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, and for a moment he seemed to steady himself. Then his knees buckled. He collapsed. Not slowly, not gracefully, one moment upright, the next. Crumpled on the floor beside his chair, utterly still. Chaos erupted instantly. Chairs overturned. Voices rose in panic. Lord Verne stumbled backward, eyes wide. The Viscount shouted for a physician. One of the barons bolted toward the door as though fleeing would solve anything. And then, impossibly, they all began to leave. Not to fetch help, to escape. As though proximity to a fallen duke might somehow implicate them, might trap them in scandal or suspicion or inconvenience. Within seconds, the dining room emptied of nobility like water draining from a broken glass. Only the servants remained, frozen in shock. And Mira moved. She didn't think. Didn't hesitate. She dropped to her knees beside the Duke, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his throat. His pulse was there, faint, uneven, but present. Your Grace, she said firmly. Nothing. She leaned closer, brushing a hand against his forehead. Clammy skin, shallow breaths. Not dead. Not yet. But something was very wrong. Behind her, the head butler appeared in the doorway, pale and stammering. The physician, he's been sent for. Miss Fenwick, you shouldn't. Mira ignored him. Because in that moment, she remembered something. A phrase her grandmother had taught her years ago, before she'd come to the manor. Words in the old dialect of the Northern Territories, the language spoken in the Duke's ancestral lands, the tongue his family had preserved even as the rest of the country forgot it. She leaned down, close enough that only he could hear, and spoke softly in that nearly dead language. A Thren six Somir. Iliad Dan. You are not alone. Come back. The Duke's eyes opened. His gaze was unfocused at first, pupils wide and searching, but when they found her face, something sharpened. Recognition, not of her specifically, but of the words she'd spoken. Words that shouldn't have reached him. Words that shouldn't have mattered. Iliad Dan, Mira repeated softly, her hand still pressed to his wrist. Come back. His lips moved, barely a whisper. Miran, the Northern word for listener, for someone who hears what others do not. Behind her, the butler had finally gathered himself enough to step forward. Miss Fenwick, the physician is on his way. You must step aside. Not yet, Mira said, her voice firmer than she'd ever dared use in this house. The Duke's breathing was steadying, but his hand had moved to his chest again, trembling. Mira recognized the signs now. Her grandmother had taught her about heart tremors, how panic could trigger them, how stress could make a healthy man collapse as though struck. Your Grace, she said, switching back to the common tongue. You need to breathe slowly. In through your nose. Hold. Out through your mouth. He stared at her as though she'd just spoken a spell. Please, she added quietly. Trust me. For a moment, nothing. Then, impossibly, he obeyed. Slow inhale. Pause. Slow exhale. Once. Twice. 3 times. The color began returning to his face. The butler hovered uselessly. Should we move him? Fetch brandy. No, Mira said. Let him stabilize. Moving him too quickly could make it worse. She didn't know where the authority in her voice came from. She was a maid. She had no right to give orders. But something about the Duke's collapse had stripped away every rule about station and silence, and all that remained was the clarity of someone who knew what needed to be done. The Duke's gaze hadn't left her face. When he spoke again, his voice was rough but present. You speak the old Tom. It wasn't a question. Mira hesitated. My grandmother taught me. She was from the northern valleys. No one speaks it anymore. His breathing hitched slightly. No one except your family, Mira finished quietly. I know. A strange expression crossed his face. Not anger. Something closer to wonder. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, the physician arriving at last, black bag in hand, face flushed from hurrying. He swept into the room with practiced efficiency, kneeling beside the Duke and immediately checking his pulse, his eyes, his coloring. Your Grace, can you hear me? Yes. The Duke's voice was stronger now. What happened? I don't know. The Duke glanced briefly at Mira, then back to the physician. One moment I was standing. The next. Heart palpitations, most likely. The physician said, pulling out a stethoscope. Brought on by stress or exhaustion. Have you been sleeping? The Duke didn't answer. The physician sighed. I'll take that as a no. He glanced at Mira, still kneeling nearby. Did he strike his head when he fell? No, Mira said. I caught him partially. That was a lie. She'd been too far away. But the physician seemed satisfied. Good. Help me get him to a chair. Together, they maneuvered the Duke into a seat. He moved stiffly, pride clearly warring with the reality that he could barely stand on his own. Once seated, he waved off further assistance, though his hand still trembled slightly against the armrest. The physician began issuing orders. Rest, no travel, light meals, absolutely no business dealings for at least a week. The Duke listened with thinning patience, clearly already planning to ignore most of it. Then the physician turned to Mira. You acted quickly. Well done. Mira lowered her eyes. I only did what anyone would. Most didn't, the Duke said quietly. The words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, because everyone in that room knew the truth. The nobility had fled. The servants had frozen. Only Mira had moved. The physician packed his bag and departed with instructions to send for him if anything worsened. The butler ushered the remaining servants out, leaving only Mira and the Duke in the vast, silent dining room. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the Duke looked at her fully for the first time. Not past her. Not through her. At her. "What is your name?" Mira blinked. You don't know?" "I don't." Heat crept up her neck. 8 months she'd worked here. 8 months of serving his meals, maintaining his rooms, existing in his household. And he had never once asked, "Mira Fenwick, your grace." He repeated it slowly, as though testing how it fit. "Mira." Another silence. "Why did you speak to me in the old tone?" he asked. Mira hesitated. The honest answer felt too vulnerable, too revealing. But something about the way he looked at her, tired, shaken, stripped of the armor he usually wore, made lying feel impossible. "Because," she said carefully, "I thought if you were lost somewhere, you'd need to hear something familiar. Something that felt like home." His expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but opening, just slightly, like a door left unlatched. "It worked," he said quietly. Mira didn't know what to say to that. The Duke leaned back in the chair, exhaustion finally overtaking pride. "Everyone left." "Yes." "You stayed." "Yes." "Why?" The question was so direct it startled her. Mira looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly from adrenaline. "Because leaving someone when they're hurt is unconscionable. Even a duke? Especially a duke," she said before she could stop herself. His eyebrows rose. Myra's heart lurched. She'd overstepped. Badly. "I'm sorry, Your Grace. I didn't mean, no." He held up a hand, stopping her. "You're right." Another long pause. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. "Thank you." Mira nodded, throat tight. The Duke studied her for a moment longer, something unreadable in his expression. Then he stood, slowly, carefully, and straightened his coat. "You may go." Mira rose and curtsied, then turned toward the door. "Miss Fenwick." She paused. "I won't forget this." Mira glanced back. The Duke was watching her with that same strange intensity, as though she'd just become visible to him in a way she hadn't been before. She didn't know yet how dangerous that visibility would become. The household changed after that night. Subtly at first, small shifts that most wouldn't notice. But Mira noticed everything. The Duke began appearing in corridors he'd never walked before. The library where she dusted at dawn. The kitchens when she collected breakfast trays. The garden path she took during her brief afternoon break. He never spoke to her during these encounters. Never acknowledged her directly. But his presence lingered like a question he didn't know how to ask. The other servants noticed too. Whispers followed Mira through the halls. Jealous, curious, worried. The head housekeeper pulled her aside one morning with a warning disguised as advice. "His Grace has been attentive lately," the woman said carefully. "It would be wise not to mistake gratitude for anything more." Mira understood the real message. Don't get ideas above your station. She tried to follow that advice. Kept her head down, her movements efficient, her interactions minimal. But 3 days after the dinner, a summons arrived. The Duke requested her presence in his study. Myra's hands shook as she knocked. "Enter." He stood by the window, silhouetted against afternoon light. The room smelled of leather and old paper and something faintly medicinal. Evidence the physician's orders were being ignored. "You asked for me, Your Grace?" He turned. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, but his posture had regained its usual control. "I did." Silence stretched between them. "I've been thinking," he said finally, "about what happened. About the guests who fled." Mira waited. "Lord Verne sent a letter this morning, apologizing for his abrupt departure, suggesting we reschedule negotiations." The Duke's expression hardened. "He claims he left to summon help. And the others?" "Similar excuses. All lies." He crossed to his desk, fingers drumming once against the polished wood. "They abandoned me because a sick duke is a weak duke. And weakness, in their world, is contagious." Mira said nothing, because he was right. "But you stayed." He continued, looking at her directly now. "Why?" "I already told you." "No." He stepped closer. "You told me leaving someone hurt is unconscionable. But there's more to it than that. You spoke to me in a language you shouldn't know. Used words that shouldn't have mattered. And somehow, they brought me back." Myra's throat tightened. "My grandmother always said the old Tom carried memory. That it could reach people even when common words couldn't." Your grandmother was right. He paused. Where is she now? Dead. 3 years ago. I'm sorry. The gentleness in his voice nearly undid her. Mira looked away, blinking hard. She would have liked knowing her lessons helped someone. They did more than help. The Duke moved to the side table, pouring 2 glasses of water with steady hands. He offered her one. Sit. Mira stared at the glass, then at the chair he'd indicated. Your Grace, I shouldn't. Please. The word was quiet, but absolute. Mira sat. The Duke took the chair across from her, not behind his desk, but facing her as an equal. The gesture felt impossibly significant. I've spent the last 3 days, he said carefully, reviewing everything I thought I knew about loyalty, about power, about which voices matter in this world. He set down his glass. I was wrong about most of it. Mira's pulse quickened. The people I trusted fled. The person I'd never noticed stayed. His gaze held hers. That means something. It means I did my duty. It means you have more courage than an entire room of nobles. He leaned forward slightly. And more worth than I was capable of seeing. Heat flooded Mira's face. You don't have to say that because I'm not saying it because of obligation. I'm saying it because it's true. For a moment, neither spoke. The study felt smaller somehow. More intimate. Lord Vern will return, the Duke said finally. He'll push harder next time. Threaten more openly. And the others will watch to see if I band. Will you? No. The word was iron. But I'll need people. Around me I can trust. People who won't flee when things become difficult. He paused. People like you. Mira's breath caught. What are you asking? I'm asking if you'd consider a different position. Not as a maid. As an advisor of sorts. He must have seen her shock, because he continued quickly. Your grandmother taught you things most people have forgotten. Languages. Histories. Remedies. Knowledge that's been lost to families like mine because we stopped listening to people like her. Your Grace, that's necessary, he interrupted firmly. And long overdue. Mira stared at him. The household would never accept it. The other nobles would. Let them talk. His expression was resolute. I've spent years letting other people's opinions dictate my choices. It nearly killed me. The bluntness of that statement settled between them like truth finally spoken aloud. I need people who see me as something other than a title, he said quietly. And you're the first person in years who has. Mira's hands twisted in her lap. Everything in her upbringing screamed that this was impossible. That girls from northern valleys didn't advise dukes. That kindness during a crisis didn't erase the gulf between their worlds. But then she remembered her grandmother's voice. The old ways didn't die because they were wrong. They died because people stopped fighting for them. If I say yes, Mira said slowly, everything will change. I know. People will assume things. Cruel things. Let them. And if you regret this? The Duke met her eyes with absolute certainty. I won't. Mira studied him. This man who'd collapsed in front of an audience and been abandoned by everyone who claimed to respect him. Who'd woken to the sound of a language he thought was lost. Who was now offering her a place in a world that had never wanted people like her. She thought of her grandmother. Of the old words. Of the truth that some things mattered more than fear. Yes, Mira said. I'll stay. The Duke's expression transformed, not into a smile exactly, but into something warmer. Relief. Gratitude. Hope. Thank you, Miss Fenwick. Mira, she corrected quietly. If we're to work together, you should call me Mira. He nodded once. Mira. The name sounded different in his voice. Like something worth remembering. Over the following months, the county watched in scandalized fascination as the Duke of Ashford restructured his household around a former maid who spoke languages no one else understood. Lord Vern tried twice more to force negotiations and failed both times. Other nobles whispered and schemed and eventually accepted what they could not change. And in the quiet moments between meetings and decisions and slow, careful conversations that rebuilt what panic had broken, something unexpected took root. Not romance, not yet, but partnership, respect, the beginning of trust between two people who'd learned the hardest way that titles meant nothing when measured against courage. Years later, when Mira Fenwick became the Duchess of Ashford, a scandal that rocked the peerage and changed succession laws across 3 territories, people would ask how a maid had captured a duke's heart. The answer was simpler than they wanted to believe. She hadn't captured anything. She'd simply stayed when everyone else fled. Spoken words that mattered when silence would have been easier. and reminded a dying man that being seen, truly seen, was worth more than every title in England.